Welcome to this episode of SAM Conversations. Today is Thursday, June 25th, and we are looking primarily at the state of play as far as the troubled India-China bilateral relationship is concerned. And concurrently, over the last few days, there have been other developments which have also added to the national security and diplomatic challenge. To briefly recap, I'm just going to flag a couple of reports that have appeared in the media and see what we can make out of them. The first is one of our major dailies, and actually all of them have made the same point, that notwithstanding the various talks between India and China at different levels, post Galwan, despite the fact that there is an assurance from the Chinese side that we would begin the process of disengagement, it appears that over the last 24 hours, there have been certain developments on the ground. And I'm quoting one newspaper which says, quote, closer to the strategic DBO, the airstrip there, China opens a new front at Depsang, unquote. This is the headline. Related to this, we of course have a major development on the India-Pakistan front, where India has decided to reduce its diplomatic staff because of other developments related to the challenge of terrorism and India's own determination about the role that Pakistan is playing. So this is also a significant development that we have reduced the diplomatic staff there. I'm sure there'd be a reciprocal move from Pakistan's side also. The third, which is unusual, and I'm sure that all South Asia watchers would be observing this, is that the India-Nepal relationship has also been discordant. And for the first time in years, in decades, perhaps never before, we have a situation where media reports again say that the Nepalese army has been placed on alert along the border, what has often been seen as an open border. So these are, as I said, complex developments, and to help us to understand and place them in the appropriate context, I have great pleasure in inviting two of India's most eminent, I would say, professionals, very senior members of the strategic community who have contributed immensely to the public discourse after they have laid down office. Allow me to welcome Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff and a chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Now, of course, he has been offering his views and advice periodically from Goa, where, of course, I think the quality of life is much better for a variety of reasons, but I won't get into that. Arun sir, welcome on board. It's always good to have a chat with you.
Thank you there.
Allow me also to introduce, not that he needs an introduction, but welcome Ambassador Shyam Saran. Shyam Saran has been a former Foreign Secretary of India, a very distinguished diplomat. He's also been the Prime Minister's special envoy on a number of very critical and sensitive issues, as also the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. He's had many other accomplishments and hats, but currently he very modestly describes himself as a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Shyam sir, welcome on board also. I don't know if Shyam is there, but anyway, what I will do is, okay, now I will, fine sir. So what I'll do is I will request Admiral Prakash to perhaps share his own thoughts first. Arun sir, as I said, if you could just look at the spectrum of the security and strategic challenges for India, of which China and Galwan, of course, is the most visible. You wrote a very thoughtful piece which appeared in one of the dailies today, where you had given some long-term policy recommendations, including a review of India's political objectives. So can I request you to go first, sir? Arun sir?
Well, our main concern today is China. So let's focus on China. And minds far better than mine have been applying themselves to what's happening in that direction. Now, everybody knew that China was rising economically, militarily, and its aim was quite clear, becoming number one of these days. But the timing of China's strange actions has puzzled everyone. There's a worldwide pandemic, and that's the time that China has chosen to bare its fangs in a wide spectrum of spheres. In South China Sea, it has picked up fights with almost all the countries which are surrounding the South China Sea. Taiwan, Hong Kong, there are problems. There was a report that it may have carried out a, a new small nuclear test also. And then, of course, it's turned its attention to India in a most unwelcome manner. As far as India is concerned, sorry, before that, there is also speculation that there may be some internal turmoil in China, some kind of power struggle about which we don't know very much. Maybe Ambassador Shyam Saran will tell us about it, about Xi Jinping's position in the party and in relation to the PLA. Now, as far as India is concerned, the general consensus is that China sees it as a eventual peer competitor and wants to make sure that India is distracted in as many ways as possible and its rise is delayed, if not prevented. So on our northern borders, China seems to be testing us. I mean, it is almost harking back to the 1962 scenario where we had said we'll occupy forward positions, and then China pushed back and they gave us a hard knock. It was meant to be a lesson to India. Now, the same scenario seems to be more or less being repeated in the northern, on our northern borders, where of course we made a great deal of progress as far as border infrastructure is concerned. And one of the most significant developments there is a Dabruk Daulat Beg Oldi road, which will facilitate a lot of movement for our troops. So that seems to be the final tipping point. So China is pressing all along the northern borders. And as you said, they've opened different, they tried to test us. Now, I don't know if I was sitting in Beijing, how I would perceive India's response to China's pressing us. One thing is, of course, quite obvious. I don't have to reveal that. There's been a little bit of confusion. There is no coherence in our response so far. Perhaps the military knows exactly, the army knows what it's doing. But as far as Delhi is concerned, things are not very reassuring in terms of coherence, in terms of a focused response. So if China is testing waters, then it will keep pushing, and then it will see how far how much we will take. Obviously, neither country would like to go to an all-out war. It's not good for either in many ways. So definitely, China will press us to see the limit of our endurance, and I think that's what's happening right now. The rest we can discuss as the discussion goes along.
Thank you, sir. I think, the summary as I see it is that China is posing a very, very serious challenge. And my own conclusion is that despite the so-called agreement to disengage, it doesn't appear that it's on the cards, and whether or not they'll walk the talk is a question mark. But let me take this to Ambassador Shyam Saran. Shyam sir, you heard Admiral Prakash. So I'll request you to perhaps comment, add to this, because if I recall right, as the chairman of the NSAB, you had done a very detailed review of the entire border and the infrastructure, and you made various recommendations. So can I request you to please share your thoughts about the spectrum of India's current challenges? Shyam sir?
Thank you, Uday. Thank you for inviting me to this very special, event. We are living through very troubled times, and this heightened tensions at the India-China border is something that we in times where we are already having to deal with a very major crisis like the pandemic. It is very unfortunate that our attention has now to be also focused on this very serious threat to India's national security. I broadly agree with what Admiral Arun Prakash has said, so I will not repeat his very important observation. Let me try to at least remove some of the fog that seems to have developed around what we are facing in eastern Ladakh. One, there seems to be some kind of an impression that there is some ambiguity about the line of actual control. That there are places where we ourselves don't know where the line of control is. This is absolutely wrong. We know perfectly well where our line of control is. So to say that the line of control is somewhat ambiguous, and sometimes these problems arise because of differences in perception. Difference of perception is on the Chinese side. Difference of perception is not on our side. So we should not create ambiguity about our line of actual control. That is a very important thing, because somehow the commentary seems to suggest that, we also don't know where the line of control. We know perfectly well where the line of control is. Also, whenever, Indian patrols encounter Chinese patrols, what do? We tell the Chinese, you are on our territory. Please go back. The Chinese, yes, they also say, you are on our territory, please go back. So if we are ambiguous about our own line of control, we are in fact undermining our position. That is one point. Second point I am very, very concerned about is some commentary suggesting, that we should be looking at some kind of a buffer zone between the two sides. You can't have a buffer zone on your territory. If you claim this to be your territory, it is your national territory. There is no such concept as a buffer zone in my own territory. So that is very important. The other, sometimes I hear is, oh, there is no man's land somewhere, so they have come in. No, there is no such thing as no man's land. So I think we have to be very, very clear on this particular issue, because unless we are clear as to what the facts are, our responses will not be appropriate. So I wanted to clarify these things, because these are important in terms of the discourse that is taking place. Now, what is happening? My own interpretation is that, if you remember in 1962, China claiming to what it said was its claim line. Then it retreated about 20 kilometers, not in each and every place, but it generally retreated 20 kilometers from where it had come to its claim line. So yes, it had come into Galwan, but that area was then vacated by China. What one sees is today an attempt to in fact go back to the old claim line. So we should be quite clear as to what the Chinese intent is. It is in fact to get back to what their claim line is and the territory which they had actually occupied during the 1962 operations. And by the way, such kind of ambition has sometimes appeared in Chinese literature, particularly in PLA literature. So there is perhaps today a sense within the leadership that because India is preoccupied with COVID-19, because the imbalance between the two sides is in fact has expanded, because the rest of the world is also preoccupied with this crisis. So the international environment is in a sense distracted. So this is actually a good time for China to advance its claims, advance its forces into areas that it claims, and India would not have much of a chance to be able to resist this because it simply does not have those capabilities. Also, the view that India is so quickly building up its border infrastructure that maybe there is this window of opportunity just now which may no longer operate after some time. So if you will see the latest statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has alluded to the border infrastructure development as one of the trigger points for this conflict. Yeah.
So I'll come back to you and request you to perhaps talk to us about Nepal and Pakistan.
So there is no doubt in my mind that the kind of, shall I say, attempt on the part of Nepal to really, subdue it with the territorial claim in the Ladakh area is very much related to the China factor. It is related to the China factor because given the pressures which are operating on India from China, Nepal looks at this also as an opportunity to advance its claims. So I'm not very surprised in that respect, because
Shyam, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just one. Arun sir, please go ahead if you can hear me on the maritime issue.
Please repeat your question. I missed some audio.
What I was trying to draw your attention to is that in the last few days, there's been a suggestion that if India is not able to respond adequately, effectively on the land border, that we should look at the maritime domain. And there was one specific reference that we should be talking to the Quad countries. You had also mentioned that. And in the last couple of days, the former Foreign Secretary, Vijay Gokhale, he spoke about underwater domain awareness. So could you just walk us through the maritime option and what is it that we should be looking at, given the fact, of course, that the Indian Navy has less than 14% of the overall defense budget? Arun sir?
Yes. Okay. One shouldn't let imagination sort of run riot and say there's a whole maritime option available instead of the military option. It's not that. What is happening on land will have to be handled by the Army and the Air Force, and that has to be accepted. But what we can do is to raise the pressure. Even if we are going to negotiate with China, which we will have to, we should try and negotiate from as much of a position of strength as possible. What happens on land, one doesn't know. But certainly at sea, on the maritime domain, there are places where we can put certain amount of pressure on China without exaggerating it too much. Now, we all know that China's economy is dependent on trade, very heavily on trade. China's industry is dependent on energy, oil and energy. It's the world's biggest energy importer. And 90% of its energy comes from by sea through tankers or gas carrier. Similarly, its trade is dependent on raw materials which come from all over the world, from Africa, from South America, from Australia, and its export finished goods also go out by sea by container carriers and so on. So all said and done, China is very heavily dependent on the sea lanes for its industry and for its economy. Should there be any kind of interruption on the sea lanes, interruption in trade, interruption in the supply of energy, it will certainly have implications, severe implications on China's economy. And China's economy is far more sensitive than ours as compared to ours, because any interruption, any little hiccups there will impact on the social front. The Chinese people have got used to a higher standard of living, and any hiccups there will impact. So, all said and done, if we were to use this option, the Indian Navy is almost dominant in the Indian Ocean, and a majority of China's seaborne trade passes through the Indian Ocean, which is at our doorstep, whether it's coming or going to the Gulf, whether it's going around the Cape to Africa, or it's going to South America. So India has the option of mobilizing its navy and perhaps undertaking a show of force as far as China's shipping traffic is concerned. Now, the high seas are a public domain. You can't go around, capturing ships or even boarding ships. It would be internationally illegal. But then on land, so is a transgression on land illegal. So is killing of our soldiers illegal. So I think somebody at the highest level in the national security decision-making system will have to weigh and balance whether we could put up a show of force, could threaten China's trade and economy on the high seas, especially in a place like Andaman. If we were to just fortify Andaman, position a few warships there, maybe a fighter squadron or submarine, it would send a clear message that should push come to shove, and there's plenty of pushing and shoving going on in Ladakh, and should push come to shove, we can act at sea. And that would be a very useful message to send to China when we are going to enter some kind of negotiations, and China seems to be having the upper hand right now. So that is my suggestion, that it's not a magic wand, but it's an option which is clearly out there and to which we've not paid sufficient attention. And I think it's high time that we did.
Thank you. What I will do is now request Ambassador Shyam Saran perhaps to come in and talk about the Pakistan-Nepal issues and how they have also added to the nature of the challenge that India is dealing with now. Shyam sir, can I request you to come in?
Yes, thank you, Uday. What I was trying to point out before we got interrupted was that whether it is the new, rather aggressive posture which has been adopted by Nepal, or whether we see greater activism by Pakistan on the line of control, there has not been a diminution of terrorist activity across the border. I think these are all related to the current state of relations between India and China. So it is that the worsening of relations between India and China is seen as providing the space to leadership in Nepal, to leadership in Pakistan, to try and advance their own interests vis-a-vis India. So we should understand that broader context. China is very much a factor in their calculations. Now, as far as Nepal is concerned, the trigger for what has happened on the border is perhaps related to some domestic political situation within Nepal, because the Prime Minister Oli has been under tremendous pressure in Nepal from some rivals within his own party, and he may have seen this kind of a nationalist initiative as giving him some political relief, and it has in fact precisely happened in the manner that he would have thought. So we see that activism on the part of Nepal as a result of both domestic factors as well as the expectation of Chinese support. But it is a fact that at no other time in history of independent India and Nepal have actually we faced such a situation where there has been a unilateral advancement of territorial claims, and there has been actually very abusive language used not only about the Indian leadership but also about India's national symbols in Nepali parliament. So in that sense, relations are probably at an all-time low. Now, the question is, how do we respond to this? Responding by trying to, penalize Nepal in some way, I do not think that in the current situation that we face, we will be able to make much headway. So I would suggest that we keep our head down. We are faced with a fait accompli from the Nepali side. We should reject it, and at an appropriate time when the dust settles down, perhaps it would be time to get into a dialogue process with Nepal. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, I really believe that we have painted ourselves into a corner, because we have now ended up actually facing what was a kind of a nightmare scenario before, of a kind of a two-front war. That is, both China as well as Pakistan become live adversaries. They were always adversaries, but if the Pakistani front was live, the Chinese front was at least relatively peaceful. Now we are faced with a live situation on both borders. Now there is a serious rethink which is necessary about how we deal with Pakistan. And the latest incident that you have referred to in terms of reducing the numbers of staff in the Pakistani High Commission in Delhi, and presumably there will be a similar move by Pakistan, I think we are going in the wrong direction. Actually, we should be looking at ways in which we can begin to engage Pakistan. Because I think if we are going to get into a situation where we have two rather hostile.
Okay, now we have come to the last section of this conversation. And I know both of you are wise men who have a lot in the hard disk and the water table. But this is not a trick question, but can I request you in the next few minutes, because the way in which both of you have framed it, this is a very complex challenge, and the higher defense management of the country, the Prime Minister downwards, are trying to grapple with a number of issues, including the pandemic, which is, I would say, the most immediate health crisis. So Arun sir, if you'd like to go first and just talk about, how do we sort of proceed, because the citizens of India are very concerned in different ways about what is happening. Arun sir?
So what's the question? I mean, what topic are we
For
addressing?
India, what are the options as we go ahead? We continue to engage diplomatically with China, with Nepal, and proceed. What next?
Okay, as Ambassador Shyam Saran pointed out, I think our worst nightmares are coming true. Is that we've got two fronts, hostile fronts, simultaneously. Now, some of our generals have been pointing out that they are ready for a two-front war. They've even gone to the extent of saying 2.5 front, by which they meant the northern front, the western front, and the domestic front, which, in my opinion, is a bit far-fetched and very ambitious. So I don't think we have raised armed forces which can tackle two fronts even. I mean, our northern border is 2,500 miles. Our western LOC is about 500 miles. The international borders, another 2,000 miles. So we don't have armed forces for that. And as a poor developing country, we shouldn't be devoting so much resources towards raising armed forces for this kind of a commitment. So one hopes that diplomatically and politically, we will be able to manage our borders so that we don't need to face such a hostile situation. And again, everything seems to have gone against us. I mean, our closest neighbors have suddenly turned hostile. With China, there is a very hot situation. With Pakistan, also things are simmering. I'm sure that war has been considered, but it is unaffordable, not for China, not for India, certainly. So short of war, what do you do? I mean, negotiations is the only way out. You have to engage with both your neighbors and find a modus vivendi. Now, just harking back a little bit to what Ambassador Shyam Saran said about us knowing where the LSE is, that, well, I agree. I mean, we know where the LSE is. So does China. But the flaw here is that, have we told each other where each other's LSE is? Have we come to some kind of understanding? Otherwise, China says we know where our LSE is, but we won't tell you. And then they keep wandering all over the border, and same with us. So I think our first issue should and start a dialogue whereby we declare our LSE, we exchange maps. I believe it was tried in the past, but it didn't work. But that should be the starting point and end point of everything. But unless you stake your claim and you're leaving everything vague, and it's an open house for China to walk in anywhere and say, this is my perception of LSE. And we've been making excuses on their behalf by talking about difference in perception. I mean, where's the question? It's a national boundary. Either they're in or they're not in. So I think that's the first issue to be discussed. We should engage in serious negotiations, and we should not leave the negotiation table. In fact, we should bundle everything together. If they want to continue trade with us, it's conditional to sorting out the boundary problem. They want to have cultural relations, and we should tell the whole world that here is the country, here is the big neighbor which is refusing to discuss an international boundary. Nowhere else in the world is there such a situation. So that's number one. Secondly, if we are to speak from a position of strength, then we must bolster our defenses all along. Whatever resources we've got, let's put it up right up to our perception of LAC and say this is where we stand. And if you take a step aside, then we'll probably go kinetic. I mean, this business of not using firearms and all that is all right, but they're endangering the lives of our soldiers. So that's track two, that we should stake a claim to right up to where our line of actual control is. And China may be overall stronger and bigger and more economically powerful, but locally we can hold our own. Our army, our air force are well capable of holding our own. And as the phrase goes, popular phrase on TV, we can give them a bloody nose here and there. And I'm sure that they will back off unless they want a full-scale war, which nobody wants. And lastly, of course, we've got to reach out and seek allies, friends, partners, wherever we are. I have suggested in the article that we should moot a concord of Indo-Pacific nations looking for peace and tranquility. The Quad is already there. The Quad has been very apprehensive because every time someone talks of mobilizing the Quad, China shouts containment, and then Xi Jinping makes noises and everyone backs off. So here is the time for India to stand up and say, look, this is the time. If you're really serious about Quad, let's get together and then expand the Quad. There are other countries which have grievances with China. There is Vietnam, which is being pushed around at sea. Philippines, although it's ambiguous, but again, Philippines needs help. Malaysia, Indonesia. So let's move the proposal. China will not like it, but at least it will send once again clear signals that there are people who are willing to stand up to you. It's not going to be a one-way race for you. And then, as I said, let's show our presence at sea and pose some kind of a threat to China. So this is the overall bundle, which I'm sure our diplomats know far more about these things than sailors like me.
Ambassador Saran, if I could request you to wrap this up for us in the time available, there are 2-3 things. And the SAM pitch, we are looking at the average citizen of India, the younger generation, who may not really remember or recall 1962. But if I can summarize what we have said till now and what Admiral Prakash has just pointed to, India has been talking to China formally since 1993, when we had the Jiang Zemin Narasimha Rao agreement. And there has been specific reference on the agenda points about the LAC. I understand that they have not exchanged any maps. So while we may not have any doubt about where the LAC is, for now, post Galwan, do you see this as an objective for India, both politically and diplomatically, about returning to the status quo, which is the positions that were occupied in early April before all this started? Is that something that's feasible? That's one. And the second issue, whatever Admiral Prakash has said about the maritime domain and the quadrilateral, does it have any immediate potential for traction? So these are 2 issues.
In terms of the current situation at the border, when we were looking at how do we develop some kind of a strong deterrent capability to be able to respond to some of these intrusions, one of the ideas was that this is a fairly long border, and there are several places where we are in a dominating position, where it is possible, if there is an incursion at one place, it is possible for you, in fact, to move in quickly with the right kind of forces in some other location. Because if you want to get back to status quo ante after some incursion has taken place from China, then you need some bargaining counter if you don't want to go to war to push them out. So the idea was that where are those places where we could actually, in the event of such a situation arising, are there places where we can also, by using our very mobile forces, in fact, capture some territory on the other side. I do not know whether that exercise was carried through, but that is something to think about. The second thing is that the agreements that you refer to, the 1993 agreement, the 1996, 2005, 2013, let me make it very clear that in 1996, the second agreement which was signed on peace and tranquility on the border, that agreement specifically, in fact, mentioned the identification of the line of control as one of the key elements in maintaining peace and tranquility on the border, and did say that the 2 sides should exchange maps where we would show where we believe the line of control is, and the Chinese would show where their line of control is. We would thereby know which are the areas of divergence, and then try and negotiate, some kind of a compromise on those sectors. But when actually the exchange of maps began, the only sector for which maps were exchanged was the central sector, where the differences were relatively minor. As soon as we had the exchange of maps for the western sector, we gave them what we regard as our LSC. So it is not that we were ambiguous about where the LSC was. We gave them a map showing where we considered the LSC. They also gave us a map showing their LSC. But when they saw our LSC, then they said, oh, we are taking back our map, and here is your map back again, because you are making very large claims as far as the LSC is concerned. And after that, they refused to take this exercise forward, even though this was also agreed in 2005, when we had the political parameters and guiding principles. So there has been not enough of pressure from our side to hold the Chinese to that commitment. Because otherwise, if you refuse to tell us where you consider your LSA to be, then you are basically saying that this is open season. Wherever I say, I go in, I will say this is my territory. So I think we need to have a well, thought out, diplomatic sort of strategy to be able to get the Chinese side to deliver on the commitment they themselves have made. It's not that we are making a demand. It is a commitment they also have made. And this is fundamental to maintaining peace and tranquility. So that is one point. The other issue is that, one of the reasons why we keep having to fall back upon ad hoc responses to whenever some kind of a crisis or a difficult situation arises is because we don't have a national security strategy. Every time that we have tried to, get people together, the best minds together to evolve a proper national security strategy, the political leadership does not want to, have that even in the public domain. So I'm not surprised that in the absence of such a national security strategy, each time something happens, you are only able to fall back on ad hoc responses. So my final recommendation is, because without that, other recommendations will not, I'm afraid, make much sense. The first order of business is, please get down to formulating an appropriate national security strategy for India, in which we make a proper assessment of what are the national security threats we are facing, what are our assets, what are our vulnerabilities, how do we leverage our assets, okay, maritime may be assets, how do we overcome our vulnerabilities? These things have to be thought through. I accept the recommendations made by Arun, but I would say that it still has to be put in the context of a overall national strategy.
You will forgive me for saying this, and I hope it will not be seen as being impertinent. But as a security analyst, as someone who's been trying to understand and study this entire spectrum of challenges for India in the post-Cold War context, I can't help but draw attention to the fact that when you say what you did just now, Ambassador Saran, with a lot of intensity, and I would say, former Foreign Secretary, you've been a special envoy to the Prime Minister, and you are also more recently chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. And you, Arun sir, you've been a chief of naval staff, you've been a chairman of the chief, in different ways have drawn attention to this lacuna, this gap, I would say, in the overall higher defense management of India. And to the extent that 1962 was a very, I would say, sharp and rather perhaps hurtful kind of a learning experience for India. I'm just thinking aloud that will Galwan be something similar? Will it lead to a review and help us to rewire and frankly do some national introspection about both resources, funding, and objectives? But I want to thank both of you. These are complex issues. I hope we might both conversations, and I promise that we'll fix this technical kind of glitch that we've had. But there's one takeaway that Shyam Saran has offered today, which I thought I would emphasize, and which you, Admiral Prakash, had also drawn it, that from the Indian side, you, Shyam sir, have been both FS and, as I said, you dealt with many of these issues, that there is no ambiguity about the line of actual control. I think this needs to be said as emphatically as is possible, because I've also seen this commentary ascribed, and various officials, retired and otherwise, have been talking about perception could lead to a lot of, I would say, misunderstanding. And hopefully, as I said, I'm an analyst, so you let me get away with this, that maybe we need to focus on semantics in terms of phrases and words that we use, and make sure that our own discourse is appropriately agreed and consensual. But on that note, Ambassador Shyam Saran, thank you very much. Admiral Arun Prakash, sir, thank you. And I hope that we can get both of you back. On that note,
the last word is that ambiguity involves two people. So both have to agree to eliminate ambiguity.
and let's hope that we can bring this back onto the track, at least in terms of agreeing on terminology. But as I said, thank you. This is an open-ended kind of a discussion. We'll keep this going. Thank you for being with us on SAM Conversations. We'll come back to you with.
Thank you, Uday.